In the last lecture, we have discussed about what is the role of the reader and how reader-oriented criticism answers to the questions that cannot be simply derived from the text, because the meaning of the text is never self-formulated. The reader must act upon the textual material in order to procedure meaning. And even we have discussed in earlier lecture that Wolfgang Iser argues that the literary text always contain blanks which only the reader can fill. And we have taken the example of Wordsworth's poem, and we have tried to discuss all those Wordsworth's poem. Even we have taken Umberto Eco's very famous The Role of the Reader, and talks about the openness and closeness of the text. We also talked about the narrative, what Anthony Trollope wrote. We have discussed all those things. And then I pointed out that we have to look after the phenomenology. Friends, a modern philosophical tendency which stresses the perceiver's central role. Please understand, once again, the center is in discussion. As we have seen the discussion of the center in case of deconstruction. What is the meaning of phenomenology? Phenomenology is a modern philosophical tendency which stresses the perceiver's central role in determining meaning. How the perceiver played a crucial role in finding out the meaning of certain thing is known as phenomenology. A very simple definition to remember. A modern philosophical tendency which stresses the perceiver's central role in determining the meaning is known as phenomenology. Now, according to Edmund Husserl, the proper object of philosophical investigation is the contents of our consciousness, not the objects in the world. What are the contents of our consciousness? Based on that, we initiate a philosophical investigation. The consciousness is always of something. You cannot say what about consciousness. Consciousness of something, not essentially one particular, of something. And it is the something which appears to our consciousness. This something, you cannot name it. A general thing. For the sake of our understanding, we are saying it is something, not specifying one particular thing. Something which appears to our consciousness, which is truly real to us. All these things are real to us. We feel it real to us because it is appearing to our consciousness. That's why we start to think it is real. Now, if you look very carefully, the word phenomenology and its etymological source, if you go back to its etymological source from where it has appeared, if you see it, phenomena, it comes from phenomena, phenomena to phenomenology. Phenomena in Greek, what is the meaning of phenomena in Greek? It is things appearing. Now, if you see very carefully, if you see the meaning of phenomena, things appearing, Husserl, in addition to what he said, we discover in the things which appear in consciousness. The things which appear in consciousness, we try to discover that things only. Their universal and essential qualities we are going to find out. How we are going to understand the universal and essential qualities? All these universal and essential qualities we can find out which appears in our consciousness. We are trying to search those things only. Now, phenomenology claims to show us the underlying nature in both of human consciousness and of phenomena, the thing which is appearing in it. Please understand, you start to compare two things simultaneously. Not knowingly you are doing all those things, but you are doing all those things very at a subtle level. The things which appear to you is phenomena, and something which is in your consciousness, you try to appear it in consciousness. Something appears in your consciousness, something that appears in your consciousness. If I try to give one simple example, if I say pen, when I say pen, something appears in your consciousness, considering it as a pen. Now, when the things appear in front of you, you try to compare it, you try to find it out with the qualities that appears in your consciousness and the thing really in front of you. You try to compare it. Once it is matched, you say, yes, this is pen. Because something appears, and that's something, you cannot define it what something. When I utter certain words, I have given an example to understand. And Husserl is trying to point out this particular thing, that phenomenology claims that what is the underlying nature of human consciousness and phenomena. What is the nature between these two things? Now, this was an attempt to revive the idea that individual human mind is the center. Because this idea was earlier used in romantic phase. Later on it was eclipsed. It was reviving once again. Reviving the idea that individual human mind is the center and origin of all the meaning. Whatever meaning you are going to find out is human mind. Human mind tries to get the meaning of all those things. Now, if you see in literary theories before this phenomenology, before the reader response criticism appeared, in literary theory, this approach did not encourage. This approach was not encouraged in literary theory. Literary theory is purely subjective. It is concerned with the mental structure of a critique, that what critique is thinking. And still today, most of our students of literature try to find out try to search the things through the critique, what critique is saying. And especially if you see the literary theorist, literary critique, they used to have a subjective approach towards the thing. Now, if you see very carefully that a type of criticism which tries to enter into the world of writer's work and try to simply arrive at a certain understanding of the underlying nature of or essence, you can say, of the writings which appear to that critic's consciousness. This criticism is entering into that world and trying to find out what exactly is in critic's consciousness. In this regard, if you understand phenomenology, then in this regard you will find out, my friends, the early works of J.H. Miller, the American critic, and later on who is known as one of the foremost deconstructionists, J.H. Miller, was influenced by the phenomenological theories of so-called Geneva School of Critics. And in Geneva School of Critics, you'll find out there are two very famous critics, Georges Paulet, Georges, Georges Paulet, Poulet, Georges Paulet, and Jean Starobinsky, Jean Jean Starobinsky, Starobinski. These were the critics of Geneva School of Phenomenological Theories. Now, Miller, for example, did his first study of phenomenology, later on we can say converted into the constructionist study, but earlier it was a phenomenological study. He studied Thomas Hardy, the very famous English novelist, and he wrote a book in 1970 called Thomas Hardy, Distance and Desire. Now, this Thomas Hardy's Distance and Desire uncovers the novel's pervasive mental structures. It discovers the mental structures. And what name he has given for those mental structure? Distance and desire. Now, the act of interpretation, how to interpret it? This act of interpretation is possible because the text, please understand this, the act of interpretation is possible because the texts allow the reader access to author's consciousness. The text allows the readers, you can say, the reader access to the author's consciousness, which Paulette says that the author's consciousness is open to me, the text is open to me, welcomes me. Let me look deep inside itself and allows me to think what it thinks and feel what it feels. It is the text, it is the author's consciousness, when we access author's consciousness. It is the text that provides all those things. That is Georges Paulet mentions it, for which Derrida calls it as logocentric approach. If you remember something about the construction that we discussed of logocentrism and phonocentrism. Derrida would consider this kind of thinking, what Paulet has mentioned, as a logocentric. For supposing that a meaning is centered on a transcendental subject. Transcendental subject, who is transcendental subject in this case, is the author. Because the meaning is centered around what the author is trying to say. And it can be recentered, the concept of Derrida once again in the construction, on another subject. Another subject is the reader. The meaning centered around the reader. It is recentered its subject. And with the new subject, the meaning is once again derived. Now, if you see very carefully, the shift towards a reader-oriented theory is prefigured in the rejection of Husserl's objective view by his own student, Martin Heidegger. Husserl's objective that we have discussed earlier is simply rejected by his own student, Martin Heidegger. Heidegger argued that what is distinctive about human existence is its what he called Dasein, means givenness. Human existence, what is the distinctiveness, what is the feature of human existence is givenness. Our consciousness, please understand this, both projects the things of the world and at the same time is subjected to the world by the very nature of existence in the world. Please understand, this is very interesting. Our consciousness both projects the things of the world. Please remember the example of pen which I have given. And at the same time is subjected to the world by the very nature of existence in the world. We find ourselves flung down into the world. Into a time and place which we did not choose. But simultaneously, it is our world insofar as our consciousness projected. It is our world because it is projected by our own consciousness. We cannot adopt an attitude of detached contemplation. You contemplate the thing. You cannot say I'm detached with the contemplation. I'm having my own separate contemplation. You cannot detach the thing from its existence. You cannot say that I'm looking down upon the world as if from the top of the mountain or from the mountain top. We are inevitably merged with the very object of our consciousness. We have been merged into the object of our consciousness. Our thinking is always in a situation because we cannot reject, we cannot remove the situation. Our thinking is always in a situation and is therefore always historical because it is in a situation, one particular situation. One particular situation is somewhere in the past, and that's why it is to be historical. Although the history is not external, my friends. History is not external. Somebody is telling you and you are following. No, it is not external. It is something which is related with you. It is not external and social. It is personal and inward thing. A situation which is related with you and you only, not with other person, other thing, other society. Hans George Gadamer, the name which I have used in the earlier lectures also. It was Hans George Gadamer who, in his very famous book published in 1975, Truth and Method, he applied Heidegger's situational approach to literary theory. What I talked to you is Heidegger's situational approach. It was applied, he developed this situational approach. Hans George Gadamer applied this situational approach to literary theory. And Gadamer argued that a literary work does not pop into the world as finished and neatly parceled bundle of meaning. Literary work is not finished and simply carried the complete, you can say, meaning with itself. If you see, my friends, what Gadamer is trying to point out, that any literary work carries a meaning depends on the historical situation of the interpreter. What is the situation of interpreter? In which historical sense he is living with? The whole meaning of any literary text depends upon the historical situation of the interpreter. Gadamer influenced reception theory. Another important name in this regard, Hans Robert Yuas, the name which I have said you in the earlier lectures. Yuas, an important German exponent of reception theory, because if you know the base of German reception theory which Gadamer has given, because this influenced the whole reception theory what Gadamer said. Now this Gadamer's influence on Hans Robert Juas, Jauss, a German theorist who gave a historical dimension to the reader oriented criticism, reader response theories. What Juas did, Juas tried to achieve a compromise between Russian formalism, which ignores history and social theories, even which ignore the text, Russian formalism. Vladimir Prop. It achieves a compromise between Russian formalism, which ignores theory and history and social theories, which ignores the text, writing during a period of social unrest at the end of 1960s, if you see. Juas and other critics wanted to question the old canon of German literature and to show that it was perfectly reasonable to do such a thing with German literature, German old canon. The older critical outlook had ceased to make sense in the same way that Newton's physics is not adequate to the 20th century physics. That is what an understanding was developed. And Juas borrows these things from Philosophy of Science by T.S. Kuhn, Kuhn. He borrows from the philosophy of science the term which is called as paradigm. Paradigm, the term which refers to scientific framework of concepts and assumptions that are operating in one particular period. Paradigm, the term which is borrowed from philosophy of science, T.S. Kuhn's philosophy of science. Yours borrowed this term, paradigm. What is the meaning of paradigm? Paradigm is referred to the scientific frameworks of concepts and assumptions operating in one particular period. Ordinary science, my friends, please understand this. Ordinary science does it with experimental work within the mental world of a particular paradigm. Ordinary science does its experimental work within the mental world of particular paradigm. It carries a particular paradigm in its mind and it tries to make an experiment based on the things which are in the mind. This is what usually ordinary science does. Why? It does the thing up to that moment, up to that time, where you will find out until a new paradigm displaces the old one and throws up new problems and establishes new assumption. Till that time, it will carry on the same sort of paradigm. Ordinary science does these things. Since new models, new problems, if the new models and new problems are established, then it will follow that new problem. But if it is not developed, it will carry on the same thing that is happening in your mental world. It is not going to change it. That is an ordinary science used to do that. If you understand this, you ask you form of horizon of expectations. He uses a term horizons of expectations to describe the criteria readers use to judge the literary text. In any given period, not in one particular period, in any given period, the readers use a particular criteria to judge the literary text to whom yours term as horizon of expectations. Now these criteria, horizon of expectation, will help the reader to decide how to judge the poem. For example, an epic or a tragedy or any pastoral, how to judge any poem. It will also in a more general way cover what is to be regarded as poetic or literary as opposed to unpoetic or non-literary uses of languages. Because this criteria help the reader to decide the poem. Because it will cover poetic or literary and start to compare with unpoetic and unliterary. How the language is used in poetic and literary sense and how unpoetic and unliterary sense the language is used. Ordinary writing, ordinary reading, it will work within this particular horizon. It will work in this particular framework, please understand this. Take an example. Example of Augustan period in English.   . 。  . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . In Augustan period, we find Alexander Pope was one of the most important poet of that period. Alexander Pope's poetry, the very famous name, The Rape of the Lock, is this very famous poem. Now, we might say that Pope's poetry was judged according to criteria which were based upon values of clarity, naturalness, and even you can say stylistics decorum. Stylistics decorums mean the words should be adjusted according to the dignity of the subjects. However, this does not establish once for all the value of Pope's poetry. This does not establish value of Pope's poetry. If you look back into the history, during the second half of the 18th century, commentators began to question whether Pope was a poet or not. Because they pointed out, they suggested that Pope was very clever versifier, who put prose into rhyming couplets and lacked of imaginative power required of a true poet. I don't know how many of you have read Alexander Pope. How many of you are familiar with Alexander Pope? If not, please see to it. This is what Pope was alleged with. Now, if you jump, that's called as leapfrogging the 19th century, if you drop this 19th century and come to directly 20th century or modern reading, modern reading of Pope's work within a changed horizon of expectation, we now often value his poems for their wit, complexity, moral insight, and even the, the renewal of literary tradition. We used to value his poems now in modern period. Probably postmodern period will bring out some new dimensions to his poetry. That is called as hope of horizon of expectations. That is what Yoss has mentioned. The original horizon of expectations tells us how the work was valued and how that work was interpreted when it appeared, but it does not establish its meaning finally, my friends. It does not establish its meaning. If you see very clearly, it is talking about how the poem was world valued, how the poem was interpreted. Does it establish meaning of it? No. In Yo's view, it would be equally wrong to say that a work is universal, that its meaning is fixed forever, and open to all reader in any period. Because what he said, a literary work is not an object which stands by itself and which offers the same face to each reader in each period. It is not a monument, please understand. It is not a monument which reveals its timeless essence in a monologue. If you look at Taj Mahal, you cannot change the meaning of it. It is a monument. And it will carry its meaning same as it is. And that's why Yuas very categorically mentioned that literary work need not to be treated as an object. It is not giving the same meaning to the readers of every period. It will change the meaning as per the time, as per the period. This means, my friend, that we will never be able to survey the successful or the successive horizons which flow from the time of a work down to the present day, and then with what you call as an with an Olympian detachment, that you are detaching yourself with all those things and finding out the final value or meaning of that text. No, it is not possible. If you try to do this, to find out the successive horizons, the meaning we changed from period to period, time to time, you will not find everywhere. It is not recorded at every time. What would be the final meaning of this text? No, there is no final meaning to any text. The meaning can change from time to time. It is changing continuously. You cannot say that this is the perfect time or this is the proper time that we are going to get the final meaning of that particular text. No. As I said to you earlier also, that when you try to find out, I have given you an example of Shakespeare also. If you try to get the meaning of Shakespeare, you will not able to get it one final meaning of Shakespeare's text. You can that vary from reader to reader. The very interesting example you will find out with one of the very famous play of Shakespeare, Macbeth. If you see Macbeth original, you'll find out Macbeth was very much ambitious, is somehow you can say over ambitious. But how this Macbeth was projected in one of the very famous Japanese movie, Akira Kurosawa, one of the very famous Japanese director who made a movie called The Game of Thrones, or Vishal Bhardwaj, the Hindi movie Maqbool, made on Macbeth. Look out how the meaning changes of that one particular text according to the perception of that particular reader. And that's why you cannot say that the successive horizons, you cannot get the record of successive horizons, that how the meanings changed from time to time. Now, to do so, if you're trying to find out that we are going to get a final value or we are going to get a final meaning of that particular thing, if you are doing so, you would ignore our own historical situation. Because I said you earlier also that historical situation depends upon your own, not the social history. Your own history may be something different, not related with or not carry the thing which a social history can carry with itself. Now, if you are trying to find out that meaning in an earlier period, that the meaning was derived by someone, whose authority are you going to accept that what he said is the final meaning? How are you going to accept it? Are you going to accept the first reader's meaning that he got it? Or the combined opinions of readers from time to time that they had got certain opinion about certain text, whose meaning you are going to find it out? Or you are going to find out the present aesthetic judgment for it?